I am an architect by background. I never studied planning. When I was younger, I studied painting. I was always focused on the object. I thought architecture was the mother of all arts. And I started to learn how wrong I was pretty much from the minute I graduated from school. And I realized that architecture was just part of many, many other discussions. I worked for a company where filmmaking and exhibit design was much more important than architecture. And then after a pretty long career doing just architecture, I started to do more and more large-scale planning in China and the Middle East. And then I discovered that buildings were just a small part of urbanism. And urbanism is just a small part of cities. And cities are really just a small part of humans speaking with each other. And that's sort of how I ended up doing what I'm doing now. And I can just probably say I don't really do very much now except tell stories and try to work with city governments and regional governments all around the world, doing very, very large-scale strategies, sometimes just about theoretical issues of, for example, how to merge two cities that are living next to each other. But one of the things that I'm very struck by is very much how the world is changing right now. And we don't really appreciate it. You don't appreciate it because you are living it. It's your day-to-day world. I appreciate it a little bit more because, in a certain way, I come from an older world and I can sort of see a little bit what it was like before and how it's changing now. People talk about this all the time, which is the sharing economy, the rise of sharing. But I'm really, really struck at how the rise of sharing affects cities, how it affects us, how our choices are made because of external effects or perhaps internal effects. And I'm also struck in a very specific way how the rise of sharing is changing the way real estate thinks about itself. So hopefully, this is not hyper-organized, but hopefully we can kind of rush through these issues very quickly and then maybe focus a little bit on some practical implications of the rise of sharing on real estate. I'm going to be talking a little bit about this here in Amsterdam tonight and tomorrow at the Provada real estate show, but this is an issue that is kind of new and it's happening all the time. So, of course, we know about urbanization, very rapid urbanization, but what's really interesting in urbanization is the rise of cities and what that actually means. I wanted to just mention now probably one of my very, very favorite academics, perhaps in the design programs here you already study this. He's a British biologist, mathematician, classicist from the 1860s. He wrote a lot around the turn of the century. He was a critic of Darwin, although it's not that he didn't believe in evolution. He didn't think that evolution was really the only explanation for how species evolved. And he wrote this amazing book called On Growth and Form. And it, by the way, has fantastic drawings in it. And if you are interested at all in mathematics and geometry, you have got to look at his work. He wrote something which I always think about. Growth creates form, but then form defines growth and can even limit growth. So you can have a snail, for example, that at some point develops a very, very big shell to protect itself against certain kinds of constraints. But eventually the shell itself becomes a limitation for the snail, and it limits the possibilities of the snail. So there's constantly this relationship between growth and form, and sometimes they're not working at the same pace. We're going to come back to this a little bit at the end. The real interesting thing about urbanization is the rise of cities, and the fact that cities are now becoming more important than nations. and that cities are trading directly with each other without the intermediary of the nation. China doesn't really care about the Netherlands. China doesn't really care about England. But Shanghai cares a lot about London, cares a lot about Amsterdam, because people, special services, goods are being transmitted through the vehicle of the city. And you have only to look around in this room to see exactly why that's happening. This is, of course, a map of Facebook. China doesn't show up very clearly because China doesn't have Facebook, but nevertheless, this is a map of people communicating with each other. And this is really, in my mind, more important than the fact of urbanization itself. It's how globalized that urbanization is, and how we, in this very room right now, we have more in common with other people thousands of kilometers away than we do with people who are 30 kilometers away. If you think about it, first time in history where that's happened. When you look at the rise of cities, and in particular the rise of globalization and the development of cities, there are a number of factors here. These are 6, but I think these are also drivers for the rise of sharing. So you have great urbanization, you have the rise of hub cities, big cities getting bigger and denser, but you also have the other drivers, and a lot of these have to do with technology as well as socialization. By the way, I'll make this will be available afterwards, so if you want, you don't have to take any notes. So what do we want? How is the rise of the city, how is globalization, how is urbanization changing our ideas about what we want out of our cities, out of our real estate, and so forth? And one of the things that's very striking, and it's really, again, the very first time ever, we have 4 generations of people working in the workplace. This has never happened before. We have people who are grandparents' age, or what we call traditionalists, we'll go through in a second, but just think about potentially the stresses, the impacts and the possibilities of these 4 generations in the workplace. So we have the traditionalists. These are now perhaps a little bit, the age has probably moved on a little bit from then, but we call this in the US, we call it the Wartime Generation. They came of age after the Second World War, right during the Second World War. The baby boomer, I'm a baby boomer, so I was born in 1959. That's a group that has very different aspirations than the traditionalists. The Gen Xers and Gen Y to a certain extent, which is the next group. And then there's a group we call millennials now. So these are people who are born right around, right before the turn of this century. 4 generations. And it's not unusual in a city like Amsterdam, London, New York, to find all 4 generations working at the same time in the workplace. They all have different expectations about the city and what they can get out of the city. And they have different styles of working. What's really interesting to me is if you think about how these generations are different, not because some are older and some are younger, but what did they want when they were all the same age? What did your grandparents want when they were your age, for example? It's very different from what we wanted, what I wanted when I was your age, or what younger people want when they are your age. That's, to me, the interesting thing. So this, I like this array of photographs. So here are 4 generations, all roughly the same age. And you can just see almost in here an idea about how they're positioning themselves differently. So the traditionalists, our grandparents, even when they were 20 years old, were motivated by ideas of order, of loyalty, as striving for respect. These are very, very big issues for them. They became anxious, even as young people, when these characteristics were not made possible for them. My generation, when I was 20, I wanted to follow my bliss. I wanted to discover who I really, really was, what was really driving me, what were my actual interests. That's very different than my grandparents, or even my parents. The younger generation, or if I look at my kids, for example, who are roughly your age, are not really motivated, not striving to get order and respect or to be part of a big group. They're not necessarily that interested in following their bliss. They're probably more interested in maintaining open networks, communicating, and they become anxious. We become anxious in this generation now when we don't have that access to other people, other communication. We feel shut off. So very, very distinct expectations from the world, and that in turn creates a driver for growth and change. And of course, we have a new generation coming up which knows nothing about a lot of the older structures and is just in a world where communication and the free flow of information is taken completely for granted, which was very different even for my generation. So how does all of that societal change, that generational change, also have an impact on the real estate and the built environment? So here we have 4 generations in the workplace, first time ever. But what's really interesting is that you would think that you would have a linear relationship. Maybe all the way on one side you had the most traditional group. All the way on the other side you had the millennials, the sort of the most fluid group. And somehow this would be, I don't know, an extreme relationship on one side, an extreme relationship on the other side. But I think actually it's more like a circle, a continuum. I'm reaching an age now where my children are grown up. They've left the home. I don't have a huge number of expenses. I want to move, and I have moved back into the city. In fact, I've moved to the youngest parts of London because I have the freedom and the interest to move around the culture in a very different way than when I was a little bit younger. I have more in common now, at my advancing age, than to young people who are just starting out in their careers or just finishing school and moving to the city for the very first time. Gen X and Gen Y, which was a kind of rebellious generation from my perspective, are now becoming older. They're having children. They have mortgages. They have responsibilities. They actually want different things than the older generation. So it's funny how it all turns around. It's not a linear relationship. It's a circle. And perhaps that circle keeps moving around. My own interests, my own desires are being shaped by the expectations of younger people. The way I work is being shaped by the way younger people are seeing the world in a way that I've never, ever felt it before. And that is changing the way I work. It's changing the way my clients work. It's changing the way all the people in my generation who have established existing structures are working. So that's another big drive here. So if we had to kind of generalize in a big way about cities and different real estate assets, what could we say? So here's just a quick snapshot of kind of before and after of the city. So we have the rise of hub cities. The cities are becoming bigger and denser. The older city was kind of generalized, characteristic. But in some cases, especially if you are not a hub city, you cannot exist in the changing, in the age of sharing, unless you specialize. Because your work is not only for yourself, your work is now part of everyone else's work in a way that was not true for a previous generation. If I think about this phone, for example, Where's this phone made? There may be chips that come out of Irvine, California, or Worcester, Massachusetts. Gyroscopes that are coming out of Switzerland. Radio receivers that are coming out of Germany, cities in Germany. Gorilla Glass is coming out of Taiwan. Other memory chips are coming from Japan. All of this is then assembled in Shenzhen, shipped to Hong Kong, shipped to Amsterdam, shipped into Europe, and every single one of these little cities that made little parts has specialized very, very hard to make this one phone. So you can take this analog of the society itself. Individuals are now sharing their social networks. They're now sharing the work. They're part of very, very extended supply chains, and that's part of the rise of sharing. And so you start to see cities becoming very, very specialized, or having very, very specialized hubs that define what they do. It's no longer possible for a city to sprawl. And any city that wants to keep sprawling will start to struggle and will start to fail. And this is not true just for environmental reasons. It's just not efficient. They cannot trade and exchange efficiently. They cannot communicate. They cannot make products, get them out to the market. They cannot get human resources to come together and work together unless they consolidate. It changes even the way the physical city is built. Less and less emphasis on private transportation, more emphasis on walking, things that allow people to come closer together more easily. And more importantly, the whole style of government is different. So when we talk about smart cities, it's really about cities where individuals are effectively monitoring themselves as they live in the city, and that's part of the manifestation of sharing. By the way, the most extreme version of this, I suppose, is Dubai itself, which is really all about sharing. Dubai is barely a state. It is there only to allow other people to share. In the commercial sector, like office buildings, what's really interesting is how we're coming back again to a very old idea. In the early 1800s, there were no office buildings. There was no stock exchange. If you had business, you traded in the market square. If you were in Vienna, you had beautiful coffee houses that started becoming more and more elaborate. You would have business meetings with other people. You'd go to the coffee shop. The coffee shops got bigger and bigger, and then people start to say, we really should make an office building because this coffee shop business is not helping out us too much. So you start to have the development of the more traditional office building. But now, it's progressed to a point, for all sorts of reasons, office space is becoming more expensive. The cost per person in an office is getting higher. A lot of the public and social functions of the office are now leaving the office. And now we do more and more work again in the coffee shop. So even that has come around in a full cycle. But what's really interesting there is how the basic need for the office, which is to share information efficiently, is now changing because we share efficiently. We share information very differently now than we did even a generation ago. And I won't have to talk about this, but what does it actually mean to have an office? What are all the things that you do in an office? Well, there are many, many different kinds of things that you do. And frankly, you can get a lot of these other experiences outside of a formal office, which is another reason why the office itself has turned itself inside out. I don't even have a desk in my office. I work in London. I have no assigned office space. I hot desk. Pretty much all senior people in my organization do as well. So here's some attributes for office space. The really important issue is that the work is following the people. It's not that you work in an office. The work is following wherever the people work, and wherever the people go is where people do work. The offices are becoming smaller. Densities are increasing. But what's really interesting also is how people even value commercial real estate. It used to be you wanted to rent an office. How many square meters do you want? Here's the price per square meter. But now it's more like, okay, how many people will you have in your office? Because I'm more concerned about how much water, how much power everyone's going to use, and what kind of services do you have access to? So maybe in my building, if I'm investing more in public spaces, in food services, in entertainment or whatever downstairs, that's actually my cost, and I'm going to charge you a percentage of that operating cost. And I'm more interested in how many people you have in your office and how much space you take up. So again, one manifestation of sharing. And more in incubator or hotel office spaces. So I live in East London, and a lot of people go there because workspace is relatively affordable in East London. But there are a lot of other businesses that start up and they're small businesses, 2, 3 people. They're not going to take on a formal office space. They will hotel office space in all sorts of places. And there are lots of websites that allow people to do that. Residential is probably one idea that's also changing very, very rapidly, especially for someone between generations to experience. In the same way that in my generation or older generation, when we started having your own space, your own office space with a door that you could close was sort of the measure of success. The home, the private home that was exclusively your territory was a measure of success. But now, through all sorts of reasons, partially because people are much more mobile, they have friends all over the world, because they may be less territorial, they may need more money. A home is not just a home for you, but it's also potentially a home for other people as well. You know, when I was younger, Airbnb was inconceivable. You know, it was like, we had no idea. We couldn't have even come up with that idea. And now we use it all the time. It's not unusual to go to another city and effectively share someone else's home, in the same way that you might share a room in your own home. So I think there's going to be a lot more of renting out of your spaces. There's going to be a lot more hybrids, workspace that's part of the live spaces as well. Even think about assets like retail. It used to be that people only shopped, looked at, shopped, purchased things out of stores. And we all know that that's not how we buy things anymore. What's really interesting is that all over the world, people buy for 3 distinct reasons. You buy because of lowest cost, or you buy because it's the best value, or you buy in a store or some other place because it gives you the best experience. And it's usually some combination of these 3 things, which are actually quite different. Moving forward in the age of sharing, I think you're always going to have web-enabled shopping. You're still going to have traditional shops, bricks and mortar shops, but those 2 things will be combined. People will go to the shops for an experience, and they may complete the transaction for value or cost reasons somewhere else. Or online, there will be other kinds of experience which will drive people to go and pick goods up in a physical place. So I think it's going to go both ways. But the point is, it's very, very different than it was a generation ago. Even in industry, the fact that so much high-value industrial production now is very precise, it's very small, it's often very artisanal, requires lots of specialized skills. The fact that wages, particularly in developed economies, are rising pretty much at the same rate, starts to undermine the need to have low-value centers for industrial production, particularly of high-value goods. So again, industry starting to move back into cities, or logistics and storage moving back into cities because people are buying online. And they need to have the ability to pick up goods in a more distributed fashion. So even industrial areas are being changed that way. So we come back in a way to Darcy Thompson. You know, growth creates form, form defines growth. And you start to apply it to all sorts of other categories. I mean, think about what the implications are for cities in general. They're becoming bigger, they're becoming denser. Think about how cities start to agglomerate and become even larger so that they can share their populations more efficiently. Here in the Netherlands, you have the Randstad. Effectively, it's a distributed city. One, bigger city of 8.5 million people really shared out between Amsterdam, Delft, Utrecht, Rotterdam, all linked together by high-speed rail. In Europe, you start to have what we call the blue banana, which is effectively a kind of arc of cities going from London all the way down to Milan, all being increasingly networked by high-speed rail, becoming effectively one really large megacity. And those cities are no longer too concerned about what nations they belong to. They belong to each other. They trade directly with each other, just like cities used to trade in the Hanseatic League, 200 years ago. In this extreme age of sharing, think about other categories. For example, power, which normally is generated in a very centralized way. Now, increasingly, we have the ability to separate and share power in a distributed way. So if you have a fuel cell in your home, you're putting power into the grid. If you have solar power, wind power, you're generating power that you need, but you're putting the rest into a grid that's then shared with everybody else. Think even about technological change, like automated vehicles, driverless cars, which are really going to happen very, very quickly within the next 20 years. Think about the impact that driverless cars will have on the city when you no longer have to have space for cars to park outside of the street and for the car to remain idle for 90% of its time. You're going to have an increase in public realm, a decrease in space that's assigned to cars, and in a funny way, you're going to have the city, in some cases, having gone through stages of industrialization and mobility through the car, turning back into a pre-industrial form because of the advent of technology. So, these are just 3 examples of where growth has defined form, form has defined growth, and we're now sort of at this intersection of these 2 things. Anyway, this is a pretty rambling, roundabout discussion, but the main point is that we are living in an extraordinary time. We no longer value commodity ownership as much as experience. And that really, to me, is the big lesson in the rise of sharing. Thank you very much.